Gregory Hardy is moderating this session. And you see, as he comes to the podium, you see we're intentional about putting their expected date for graduation. It's an expectation. So we want to remind them regularly that we expect them to not get out of here by that time, but to move on by that time. So please welcome our moderator, Mr. Greg.
Good morning. Good morning. My name is Gregory Hardy. I'm a junior business administration major from Clinton, Maryland. I'm a member in the bioethics honors program, and I'm also a mentor in the Youth Hope Builders mentoring program. Thank you for attending today. It is my pleasure to welcome you. The speakers for this session are Mr. Ilya Davis, our keynote speaker, and Dr. Velma and Dr. Payne-Jackson. Mr. Ilya Davis is a lecturer in philosophy and religion at Morehouse College and Clark Atlanta University. Mr. Davis earned his M.T.S. degree from Harvard University Divinity School, his B.A. degree in philosophy at Morehouse College, and pursued doctoral studies at the University of Chicago in philosophy and religion. Davis has published on the social and political thought of Dr. Benjamin E. Mays and the nature of Black religious thought and practices. He was a UNCF/Andrew Mellon Faculty Fellow in 2011. He has served as the advisor for the Bill and Melinda Gates Millennium Scholars at Morehouse College. Dr. Velma Love, author of Divining the Self, a study in Yoruba myth and human consciousness, is a suicide loss survivor, a mental health advocate, and co-founder of the Lee Thompson Young Foundation, a national nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting mental and emotional wellness. She serves as an adjunct associate professor of religious studies at Winthrop University in Rock Hill, South Carolina. Her research interests include the Odu of Ifa literary corpus, Ifa divination, and indigenous African healing practices. She received the MDiv from Union Theological Seminary and the Ph.D. from Claremont Graduate University. Dr. Payne-Jackson, Ph.D., is a professor at Howard University. Her areas of research are medical anthropology, oral history, ethnographic evaluation, service learning, and sociolinguistics. She has conducted field work in the United States, the Caribbean, Latin America, and Africa. Dr. Payne-Jackson has published numerous books and articles. She has conducted ethnographic evaluation and consulting for federal agencies and community and nonprofit organizations. Two publications of importance are Prince William Forest Park, The African American Experience, and Prince William Forest Park, Conserving Space and Place. I now present to you the keynote speaker, Mr. Ilya Davis.
Good morning. Good morning. The first among many disclaimers, I am partially responsible for anything I say in light of not having coffee. So the words that come forth from my mouth are absolutely different without the added use of that drug. The second thing is, it is often a preliminary to thank people for inviting you. But I think we need to get in the habit of reserving those sentiments until after you present it, because they may no longer want to be associated with you. And so I will only refer to one person who is absolutely responsible, not for what I say, but for my presence. And I want to thank Dr. Warren for inviting me again to share some private thoughts in public, and hopefully will make some sense. Now, for these two, they have done a Herculean job. I've not heard a word from them. I've never met them in my life, but they read what I wrote. That's absolutely amazing. So I'm going to read what I wrote very quickly, because I'm more obligated than you are. And we will talk about this. Now, your responsibility, and this is an active engagement. You are my interlocutors. I expect you to criticize, critique, and analyze everything that I say in an effort that it improves over time. Now, by the time I get about 70 or 80, this may be publishable. But I need your assistance as we move through this linear period of development. What I've done is decided to discuss this as justice in need of love. I begin with a quote from Aristotle: "The state is a community of some kind." What would a concept of justice infused with a love ethic disclosed and yield for a more equitable, fair society if it were to take note of the structure of the family and love outlined by Hegel in his philosophy of right? Again, what would a concept of justice infused with a love ethic disclose and yield for a more equitable and fair society if it were to take note of the structure of family and love outlined by Hegel in his philosophy of right? He adumbrates the following: love means in general terms the consciousness of my unity with another, so that I am not in selfish isolation, but when my self-consciousness only as the renunciation of my independence, and through knowing myself as the unity of myself with another and the other with me. Love, however, is feeling, that is, ethical life in the form of something natural. In the state, feeling disappears. There, we are conscious of unity as law. There, the content must be rational and known to us. The first moment in love is that I do not wish to be a self-subsistent and independent person, that, if I were, then I would feel defective and incomplete. The second moment is that I find myself in another person, that I count for something in the other, while the other in turn comes to count for something in me. Love, therefore, is the most tremendous contradiction. The understanding cannot resolve it, since there is nothing more stubborn than this point, which he refers to as punctualitate, of self-consciousness, which is negated and which nevertheless I ought to possess as affirmative. Love is at once the propounding and the resolving of this contradiction. As the resolving of it, love is unity of an ethical type. End of quote. Hegel describes the nature of the family to be characterized by love. Love is emblematic of that concept of freedom, whereas the model is that of discrete individuals overcoming their separation by finding themselves at home in the other. The members are linked to one another and are not foreign to one another. They form a whole and are at home, the Beisik. We are, according to Hegel, at home with our families, philosophically and literally. He appears that the presence of self-consciousness of one's individuality within family, understood as a unit, is the absolute essence of oneself, and that the understanding that one is in the family as a member and not as an independent person is fundamental. Now immediately, and I'll move away from, immediately there's a tendency, particularly for oppressed people, to fear this very notion of losing oneself in another. On a micro level, we see this exemplified in the abuse that women have to take from men. I often tell students I look at racism and sexism in similar ways analogously. That is, white people are to racism as men are to sexism. We all have it. Our responsibility is to be responsible and to live up to it and try to transfuse, transmute, transcend, get away from, rebuke, refute, deny, reject. I've often had very close white friends, and they're close to me because we never had and never will have the conversation of, well, I couldn't be racist. That's impossible. Again, by analogy, that would be significant to the degree to which I could look at a woman that says, I'm in no way sexist. That's not true. We've been socialized, conditioned, and we operate under the very gaze of sexism and racism, fundamentally in the US. We can talk internationally, but fundamentally the US is genetically racist. So again, I will skip and tell you, in order not to take too lightly the nascent contradictions incubating in Hegel's attendant articulations regarding these matters, our appropriation will be taken as a suggestion that love, which portends a basis for a more equitable and more society, is fundamental. Again, the aim is to allow Hegel's formulation of family and love to initiate a conversation that hopefully arrives at inculcating this micro-cooperation into micro-cooperative structures. That is to say, allowing love under the aspect of care to be a fundamental motivating factor in social and political deliberation and implementation. These goals are practical, and this outline is absolutely experimental. The associated outline intends to attain a form of ethical life that will be sustained by love and additionally inform a pragmatic view of justice applicable to our circumscription of the best possible social arrangements available and extant. The other feature of this reimagining of justice with love is the inclusion of a view of justice held by the philosopher John Rawls. That is, his justice as fairness principle. Rawls maintains that the central organizing idea is trying to develop a political conception of justice for a democratic regime. And I refer you to his statement presented in Justice as Fairness, a Restatement. He understands that, quote, the aim of justice as fairness to provide an acceptable philosophical and moral basis for democratic institutions, and thus to address the question of how the claims of liberty and equality are to be understood, unquote. It is this aspiration of his thought experiment that buttresses these proposals. The first one, Hegel's understanding of family and love, understood here as a clue to a normative standard that is viable for our social arrangements. The second, Rawls' notion of justice as fairness as the basic framework into which the added feature of love fortifies the persuasiveness of his position and offers itself as our best social practice. Now, I'll skip the rest to focus more on the idea that's represented here is justice, as articulated by many political and social theorists, often look to how one adjudicates legal and political realms. What I am choosing to do is infuse the very notion of love as a conceptual additive. What I mean by that is, according to Martin Luther King and others, I was motivated by his statements and Strength of Love, a text of his sermons. And it was interesting to me how he constantly put forth the idea of love as this most fundamental principle in American society. Now, I disagree with King. He puts most of the burden on the oppressed. And so I'm not interested in arguing for that level of asymmetry. I'm looking for more parity here. But what's most important is, it's difficult to persuade someone that love is a political concept. So we often isolate love, we associate it with the feminine, and reduce it to an ancillary position in our political thinking. So love is not going to be imputed as things like justice. So I'm trying to look at justice only can appear if one cares enough to love. Now, people will say it's difficult to love people you've never met, it's difficult to apply love. This is how I wish it to go. That the animating feature here is not so much one will love, one thinks under the notion of love. So you have to think about it hypothetically. What would it mean if I were to act as if I loved them? That changes your perspective, right? What would it mean to act as if? Immanuel Kant refers to this as a certain type of postulate, an as if scenario. So because you don't know the particulars of everyone you engage with, the issue here is act as if. Now the difficulty here is the plethora of notions of love that exists with us all. I often tell my students, if I ask everyone, if I polled everyone in the class, what is love, we'd probably get as many answers as there are people in the room. So I will not try to essentialize the notion of love, but take your fundamental, most robust and radical notion of love and ask yourself, are you acting under that very structure when you make political and social determinations? So let's look at what's happened to the people of African descent over the last 400 years. Whether or not the interaction had been reductionist and never asked the question of, do I love? How do I love? If I were to love, would I do the things I do? Dr. Warren just brought up the syphilis experiment, right? You couldn't do that if you operated under the very notion of, am I extending love first? That couldn't happen. Why? Because there's a certain level of reciprocity. And it goes back to biblical references, it goes back to Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, that one would act in such a way that you would universalize your behavior. What I'm trying to argue for, you would act in such a way that you would universalize your notion of love, which means that when you act from your understanding of love in such a way, you would expect people to treat you equally, right? You would anticipate someone approaching you politically, socially, familially, as if they loved you. And I often say that one must lead with love. The fundamental idea here is when making decisions, love must be the animating feature. Is love the sine qua non? No, it's not a fix-all. It's not the only ingredient. But if we don't have a fundamental notion of justice that includes the concept of love, I think the game is over. I don't think there's a way out of it. Now, this notion of care that I'm representing under the term love has been represented in feminist political thinking for a long time. So Carol Gilligan, Grace Clement, these individuals have fundamentally argued for the concept of care as fundamental to how we've socialized the feminine in our culture. And what I mean by that is we normally look at the feminine as the caring quality. Now, I have two daughters and I think I absolutely care. Dr. Warren cares for his children. I'm pretty sure everyone else does. But we've been socialized to dissociate, and in particular, the masculine from the feminine ideal of care. I don't believe it's masculine or feminine. I think it's human. And what I'm aiming for is this human characteristics to somehow come through and again, deny this sort of gender-based notion of care. So, as an example, I was talking to someone yesterday. I said, the difficulty is this. I feel badly for brothers like myself because we've grown up in an environment that has told us that care, if it exists at all, should only be demonstrated on rare occasions. Deaths, the winning of a sporting event, and hearing someone say, I do. Now that's more of a dialectical situation. I don't know whether he's crying because she said I do, but that's a little more problematic. But fundamentally here, the idea is that, and I was telling someone, I don't know if she's here, a friend of mine, that women, as sexist as this structure is, you have been able to exhibit a level of humanity that we have kept stored inside of us for centuries now. You hold hands, you hug one another, you stroke one another's hair. For men to do this? Exactly. That's one of those syllogisms, you don't have to complete it, right? You know the answer, right? This is problematic though. What we're doing is undermining the very notion of what it means to be a human being. I mean, we all posit these notions. What does it mean to be human? Are there any essential qualities of being human? No, there aren't any essential qualities. There are socialized qualities that we use, right? And the hope is that we employ these behaviors to maximize the very notion of the concept of human, never perfecting it, but always aiming for the development of humanity beyond its present status. So the idea that men can't care in public or in private, and I'm being general, obviously there are exceptions to this, but the very notion that I can't love intentionally, on purpose, right? Again, not until they're dead. So as he or she lies there in the casket, I loved you, man. That's what they refer to as falling on deaf and deaf ears, right? It becomes a vacuum. There's no value there. So what would it mean for the masculine idea of human being to be represented under the very concept of care? Now, this is important because we're the ones who perpetuate the highest presentation of violence in our cultures, right? I'm not saying that women aren't, but we represent the fundamental notion of violence, right? Women, the notion of care, men, violence. Innately, well, you're a scientist, no. Well, testosterone has the proclivity to develop. Stop. One of the fundamental differences between us and other animals, we have the ability to act counter to our nature. We have the capacity to act counter to our nature. What do I mean by that? I often tell students, I say, the funny thing is, I've never seen a squirrel tell me to be careful when I cross the street. I've had no deer come to me and tell me there's a prowler. But something about being human, you don't have to know that child to say, stop. before you cross that street, look both ways. Where does this care emanate from? Where does this come from? And I associate this with a fundamental tendency of human being as verb. The way we're in the world is very unique. So what do we want to do? We want to produce this in the political and social sphere. So when political and social decisions are being made, you must invite this fundamental emotional or dispositional characteristic, and that is care, under the notion of love, right? So now we have, hopefully, a development of the notion of justice that is always asking, am I loving? So Your Honor, when you decide to give this brother or sister 30 years, what love did you employ? Did you even think about love? Again, Your Honor, I know you have your own concept, but whatever it is, I'm sure you want it because human beings, sociologically, we desire love. And the funny thing about love is there is no definitive way. Again, this is the difficulty. When you talk to someone, we may as well take out the notion of love and use a variable X. They both mean the same thing, right? They don't get you anywhere. If I go to someone and say, I love you, they will understand my articulation as their definition of love, and I will never know what they mean by it, ever. How? Love can't be articulated. But one thing love can do is be an overpouring in such a way that it can be demonstrated in public as an outgrowth of the fundamental presence of it. Right? So you never put your hand on it, but you know it's present, quanta, right? It's always there. It seems to operate, right? Subspecie eternitatis. Y'all don't know if you all read Spinoza. And this is something that he talks about with respect to God, that all things operate by virtue of the presence of a concept that's ill-defined, but it's always present. So things are animated and exist by virtue of its existence, love, right? And so I will stop. I was told by the young lady holding up the sign that I have 5 minutes. I normally tell my students, don't you move until I pack my things, but this time I'll allow it. And one last thing. The question, is there an ideal conceptual formulation? Should we be open to a fallibilistic disposition when we engage our social political interactions? And what I mean by that is, even though we're guided by the principle that I'm calling the principle, the ethic of love, we must always be open to the possibility of being wrong, even when we assume we're doing right. So old folk used to tell us, the road to whatever hell there may be is paved with good intentions. So the intent is not all you need. You need love.
I will now turn it over to our first respondent speaker, Dr. Payne-Jackson.
Good morning. I hope you all slept well. I don't know about you, but after a busy day, it's really easy to fall into that bed. All right, I am going to follow up on the concept of what is family. Family for any culture is the basic social unit that you find. But what family is in each culture will differ. In the United States, the ideal family unit for us is called the nuclear family, which is the mother, the father, and the children. We now have extended that to single-headed households and also to what he referred to as the blended, or I guess it was Dr. Warren who said the blended family, which is where you bring together the children of previous marriages into a new marriage unit. But there are other forms of family across the world. In some cultures, you will have a family where a man has multiple wives and children by those wives, and that's quite different from our culture. You will also find cases where you have multi-generational families. You have the father, the children, their wives and their children, and then the wives and the children of the grandchildren that all live within the same confine. You will also find that who is defined as family differs. Now, in America, we generally tend to say we belong to both sides of our family equally. Now, that doesn't always happen in reality because we tend to know one side of the family better than the other. One, due to mobility. We're a highly mobile society. But in other societies, your kinship depends upon which side of the family you trace down. In some societies, you belong to your father's line. In other societies, you belong to your mother's line. And we even have kinship terms that specify perhaps the father's line, but no kinship terms for the mother's line because they're not part of the family. We also have, in all cultures, this thing we call fictive kin. And again, Dr. Warren is referring to that with the auntie, who isn't auntie, actually. All right, and what I have found interesting in our society recently is how even in our school systems, our children are creating fictive families. When my children went to school, they had play brothers and sisters, they had play aunts and uncles, they even had play moms and dads. So even within their own school culture, they were creating families of support, and they knew who they could go to, for what reason, and for what purpose. We also have more formal structures. In our society, we have what are called godparents. And if you agree to be a godparent, you better be serious in your commitment. It's not to be taken lightly. In Latin cultures, you have this concept called compadrazgo, and this is where you have co-parenting. And they actually have kinship terms, comadre, copadre. And again, you are expected, if something happens to that parent, the co-parent steps in as the actual parent. It's not something that, again, is taken lightly. Compadrazgo was also used by people who moved from rural areas into the larger cities to build new family networks. Whenever there was a special event, you would get a new set of godparents or co-parents. It might be your first haircut. It might be the first day you go to school. But you have a set of these co-padre madres to help support a family when you left your support system in the community you left. Now, how we label kin also differs. In our society, we have mother, father, brother, sister, aunt, and uncle, and cousins. Well, who are your cousins? Again, it might be fictive. You may never know whether they're actually related or not. But normally we think of first cousins, second cousins, third cousins, and most of us really can't get beyond first or second. Okay? But in other societies, there's a different way to label kin. In Hawaii, your cousins on both sides are called brother and sister. Now, this has implications for marriage because a near universal taboo is you can't marry your brothers and sisters, okay? In our society, we have cousins. Now, can we marry our first cousins? Oh, you're wrong. There are 5 states that allow you to marry your first cousin. And my grandfather happened to be one who married his first cousin in his first marriage. And that was in New York, by the way. So who becomes eligible for marriage differs. In Ethiopia, you have to be able to trace back 7 generations in order to prove you're not being incestuous. All right, so you have 7 generations. Now think of how extensive that network has to be to go back 7 generations to prove you're not related. Okay? Now, how we define family and the expected connection of family is also determined at the time of marriage. When we get married here in this country, what's the first thing we do? We go out and move as far away from our folks as we can. Okay, and we set up a new residence. Now, this is fine until the first child comes along and we have to look at paying child care. And then we want to know, where's grandma? Okay, because what, $150, $200 a child? It gets pretty expensive, and you end up spending most of your paycheck taking care of child care. Okay. In other societies, they solve the problem by having the newlywed couple either go live with the husband's father's family or in close proximity, or you go live with the mother's family, her line, depending upon how you define descent. Okay. And in some cases, you begin in one area, and after the first child, you may move to the other side of the family. So how you decide how you associate with family goes even as far as to where you live after you're married. It has a lot of connections. Now, family relations imply that there has to be unity. When you have a problem, where's the first person you go to? Family. It might be mom, it might be aunt, it might be grandma, but you go to a family person, whether it's social needs, economic needs, spiritual needs, whatever the need, we go to family first because there's an expectation of reciprocity and value associated with family and their obligations to us and ours to them. Now, just as we're talking about the core unit of family and how it is defined in various ways, we also have family in terms of layers, and we were introduced to this yesterday morning. We just talked about family, but we also were introduced yesterday to the family of Tuskegee University. And then we broadened out to the family of the town of Tuskegee. And then we went even further into the family of Macon County. And each one of those layers of family carry with it obligations and a sense of commitment, a sense of community, a sense of bringing about social justice when there has been a wrong. Okay. Now, each layer of working for a common cause by this family unity is the way we can seek social justice and to repair our damages that are done by us to each other, okay? Now, ideally, love is an underlying principle of helping us move forward in a positive way. And one of the most important definitions I have ever come across, both practically and in terms of power, is found in 1 Corinthians 13. And I will read. If I speak in the tongues of men and angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so that I can move mountains, but I have not love, I'm nothing. Nothing. So if we don't have that love as a fundamental basis, we have nothing. If I deliver my body to be burned, but have not love, I am nothing. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in truth, which is part of what we are looking for. Love bears all things. Love believes all things. Love hopes all things. Love endures all things. And the most important part is that love never ends. So let each of us, as family members, from our homes to our nation, and we have a nation family, move forward. Love that never ends will lead each of us and all of us to success in ending social injustice in all forms. And as one friend of mine who I met when I was teaching in Lorton Prison had a saying, "Come, there is work to be done, so let us move forward in love and as family." Thank you.
At this time, I will now turn over to our second respondent, Dr. Love, to conclude.
Good morning. So here's love. I carry that name with great honor. I have very fond memories of my grandfather who was John Allen Love, and he always admonished us to be mindful of the name Love. And so, you know, I've been married and divorced, and my name is Love. So anyway, it's really good to be here and to see some friends and connections and people I've interacted with in different places at different times, Howard University, ITC, Tuskegee. So great. So here we are, and I want to share some thoughts about the evolution of family in terms of historical trauma and generational healing. So we may be hard-pressed to find love in historical trauma, but in generational healing, it is absolutely essential. And I think that is in part what we are doing here at this conference today. I'm starting with an African worldview of a kinship family that includes the living dead, the living, and the unborn. So right there you've got a generational span that might be difficult to imagine, because you're talking about the invisible and the visible, and that which might become at some point in the future visible. So that's a tall order. In this kind of understanding of family, we think about the human quest for Iray, and I study the Ifa Orisha tradition, and Iray is a fundamental concept in this tradition. Iray is often translated as blessings, but it means more than blessing. It means prosperity and fulfillment and flourishing and healing and wholeness and well-being. And this idea of Iray means that you've got to recognize your ancestors if you want to experience Iray in this time and this place. So the article that I submitted for advanced reading is called Negotiating Time, Space, and Spirit, a case study of oral tradition and the construction of lineage identity in West Africa. Now, I didn't write that. I wish I had written that. But this is by Claudius Fergus, and it's published in the Research in African Literature. It's a case study of ritualized ancestral memory. And this was a prescription that came forth from a diviner as a remedy for a client who experienced symptoms of mental and emotional imbalance. I think this case study is particularly instructive for us as African Americans in that it highlights the significance of this multi-generational understanding of family, kinship, ties, and the importance of oral traditions as a knowledge base from which to build strategies for enhancing Iray. And Iray is that type of life quality that we all want to experience. So I want to just kind of recap and share the story in case you didn't read this article. So Fergus tells us that in the early 1980s, someone named Florence had a daughter named Francine, and Francine was a student at a French university. When she suddenly began to demonstrate strange behavior akin to mental derangement or drug addiction. The doctors were not able to determine the cause, and she was sent back to Togo, her home, to undergo various conventional medical tests, which still were to no avail. And as a last resort, Florence's father consulted a traditional diviner who inquired whether any of his ancestors had suffered enslavement. So I want to repeat that. So in his diagnosis, using traditional medicine and healing, he wanted to know, is anybody in the family been enslaved? Now, what are the implications here? So they said no, we don't think so. We don't think any of our family people were enslaved. But the diviner insisted that the daughter's affliction was the result of the return of an enslaved ancestor, and that a remedy could only be effected through appropriate appeasement of the ancestral spirit. Florence then confronted her mother, who was a direct descendant of a woman called Arvilla. And the grandmother told the story of Arvilla, that she was kidnapped and she was sold as a domestic slave, but she was not shipped away. Instead, she was purchased by a wealthy white woman who included her in her family and made her part of a very powerful secret society. On the advice of the diviners, Florence established a shrine on her compound and prepared for an elaborate feast in atonement for the aggrieved spirit. Every detail of the feast was strictly in accordance with the diviner's instructions. The feast lasted for several days, and after this first feast, Francine, the young woman who was exhibiting signs of mental illness, experienced a remarkable recovery. On the other hand, Florence's elder sister was similarly afflicted. She refused to consult diviners, pleading that her Christian faith frowned upon such practices. She did not recover, and she passed away. So the devotees and the supporters of the shrine site that Florence established cite this as evidence that only traditional divination and appeasement feasts could keep the descendants of Arvilla clinically safe and sound of mind. Now, Fergus cites this narrative as an example of the role of oral tradition in the reconstruction of ethnohistory and the validation of kinship ties in West Africa. I cite it as an example of the impact of historical trauma on people of African descent. Arvilla, whose troubled spirit, according to Ifa diviners, caused mental and emotional disturbance. Several factors are important for us to take note of here. One is the epistemological value of oral traditions. What counts as knowledge? Oral traditions. The generational impact of cultural trauma, and the curative properties and therapeutic value of ritualized ancestral memory. So if we look at these factors a little bit closer, and we think about the epistemological value of oral tradition, Ferguson uncovered Francine's story through his field work in Africa, collecting oral narratives related to the Atlantic slave trade. He uncovered both a family history and a therapeutic strategy embraced by families. Number two, the generational impact of cultural trauma. How we negotiate time, space, and spirit is a quest for deeper understanding of the biological, psychological, social, and spiritual factors impacting wellness, both in the case of Francine's narrative and in our own. Number three, the curative properties and therapeutic value of ritualized ancestral memory. In Francine's case, her mother's willingness to follow the directive of the traditional diviner healings, even though she was a Christian. She established a consecrated ancestral altar and provided an elaborate celebration for the appeasement of this troubled spirit, and it saved her daughter's life. Now, out of my own curiosity, I contacted some ephod diviners who had been part of my own research. And I summarized this case study and I said, have you ever heard of anything like this? And they said, yes, this is not uncommon. That ritualized ancestral memory is often prescribed for maladies that someone is experiencing. So something for us to further investigate and to consider. Where in our contemporary African American society might we uncover opportunities to embrace cultural traditions? Oh, I have 5 minutes, oh my gosh. All right, okay. Where might we find opportunities to embrace cultural traditions that carry healing properties within them? Could the movement to value Black life benefit from an exploration of oral traditions that excavate ancestral strategies for survival and well-being, even in the context of a DNA carrying the impact of historical trauma? In his use of cultural trauma theory to explore the formation of an African American identity, Ron Ironman points out that the trauma in question is slavery, not as an institution or as a personal experience, but as a collective memory, a pervasive remembrance that grounded a people's sense of self. Case in point, just the other day, I overheard an African American undergraduate student talking to her psychology professor about a paper she was working on. She said, and I quote, "If all you see in the history books is about your people as slaves, I think it has to have some impact on you. And I don't know how to write about that." The professor asked her to come see him in his office, and I walked on by wondering how many African American students for how many generations have wrestled with this idea. The very idea of African Americans grows out of a cultural memory associated with trauma. So a people who fashioned a sense of self and naming comes from a tear in the social fabric. At the University of Minnesota Extension, there's a program called Historical Trauma and Cultural Healing. And the scholars here argue that historical trauma shared by communities can result in cumulative emotional and psychological wounds that are carried across generations. The effects of the traumas inflicted on groups of people because of their race, creed, and ethnicity linger on the souls of their descendants, they say. As a result, many people in these same communities experience higher rates of mental and physical illness, substance abuse, and erosion in families and community structures. The persistent cycle of trauma destroys families and communities and threatens the vibrancy of entire cultures. Historical trauma is not just what happened in the past. It's about what is still happening. Okay, I have about a minute left, right? All right. What is the antidote for historical trauma? The case that I cited above, the antidote was ritualized ancestral memory. The University of Minnesota's program also advocates cultural healing based on the philosophy that there is a therapeutic value in reconnecting to indigenous cultural values and embracing strategies that ritualize the ancestors. Yoruba scholar Roland Abiodun talks about the artist. He says the artist is the first to speak. The artist is always the first to speak because the artist is in touch with the creative energy that brings something forth for the culture and the society to use. So just quickly, if we think about the film Sankofa that was released, I don't know, in the maybe mid-90s, then everywhere across the U.S. there were Sankofa study groups and bookstores and cafes and discussions popping up, and everywhere people were talking about historical roots. So the idea of Sankofa, can we do this? Carolyn, can we do this? Can we Sankofa, can we go back in our autobiographical and in our cultural memory and fetch something of therapeutic value and inspiration, something from which to fashion a new story for the future? Can we find therapeutic value in what has been forgotten? In a non-Western worldview of family kinship ties that extend backward and forward at the same time. And I say not only we can, but we must. We must. Not only for ourselves, but for future generations. Developmental psychologists suggest that autobiographical memory provides a sense of grounding for the individual, a sense of coherence and personal identity. Stories tell us who we are. I have 0 minutes left. So in wrapping up, let me just say that these findings suggest that the children who are able to talk about their family story had a stronger sense of self, they were more confident, they were more able to cope with the challenges of adolescence and their teen years. So I just want to close by encouraging everyone to remember Francine's story and its significance for our own stories, our understanding of the family in terms of the living dead, the living and the yet to be born. Let me encourage you to accept the challenge of using your intellectual gifts to uncover, contact, and connect with the cultural strategies that can serve as an antidote to historical trauma and create new narratives that generate wholeness and well-being for past, present, and future generations. Ireo, blessings to you.
I want to say thank you to all of our speakers once again. Let's give them another round of applause. So now would be the time for questions and discussion. Any questions?
Good morning, thank you all for your presentation, and especially thank you for the relationship of the evolution of family that you discussed that helps with my presentation this month. The notion that family evolved to include those beyond the nuclear model to include the fictive, i.e. school, community, sororities, fraternities, and other families that we associate. My question is, if love is what is spilled over as a public display or actions towards the other, how can we condemn those who think the family, i.e. gangs, require the display of love to be in violence to protect and provide for the family? That's my question for you. And also, my question is for Ms. Love, if the historical rentals of fatherhood is generations of incarcerations of the men in my family, how do I not follow that?
Could you do the last statement of mine? I couldn't hear the last line.
How do we condemn those who speak the family?
Well, I mean, the question for me?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
I.e. gangs, that's my fictive family, require the display of love in that family to be violent, to protect and provide for the family.
Oh, wonderful. Well, you and I talked about this yesterday. Part of the issue was my motivation And I like to say this, I had Professor Cornell West in graduate school, but he loves running his mouth about, I say this affectionately. He says that, and I'm pretty sure if you've heard him in public, he loves to say that, justice is what love looks like in public. I was like, what the, huh? And you sit there thinking, okay, and so I was motivated. That's part of the motivation for my talk. Now, on the bracket side of this is my issue about bioethics. And I didn't have an opportunity. I cut it short, but the fundamental problem is violence is a fundamental issue for bioethics, right? Violence is extremely important. So let's look at the family as a microcosm. Later on in the paper, I say, if we take the microcosmic structure of the family and extrapolate it and try to apply the good of family to a macro level, internationally, nationally, right? So the point is, these gangs that you talk about, in philosophy, we have a term called Mariology. It's the philosophy of parts and wholes, and how do we understand parts and wholes. Gangs are family structures in and of themselves, but also members of a community of a family, right? That's somebody's kid, right? And it's funny to me, I always tell my students, I said, do you realize he goes home at night and eats cereal in the morning? Well, he gets up about 12 or 1. But when he gets up, he eats cereal. My point is, don't dissociate these people from people, right? So they have a subgroup. My subgroup, affiliated with the very concept of God, Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated, that notion becomes another representation, right? So you have the gangs that are on the street shooting. You have us, we try to do as most positive as we can, but the idea is both represents family concepts, right? This familiar relationship, losing oneself in the greater idea of the whole and so forth. It's the output. So you often will hear the notion of good idea, bad execution. That's the problem with gangs. Good idea, bad execution. It was good to come together and try to formulate a support group. I know you never looked at gangs as support groups, but it's a support group, right? I need somebody, right? And I don't subscribe to this, but this is the whole idea, I'll die for him, which is silly, but I'll die for him. And so for me, I have a very paradoxical relationships with gangs. I grew up in an environment where I grew up at a time where it wasn't so much gang as the people you hung out with. So the sort of lexical ascription as gang was confusing, right? Oh, I didn't know we were a gang, right? We didn't have an official name, but if you touch one of us, believe it, it was going down, right? So the point had more to do with familiar relationships, good idea, bad execution. And so I would even like to segue to the notion that you brought up about father. The problem I have is, and I said this last year, I'm more interested in good parents, right? I have 2 daughters. I would hate to think if their mother died, that someone would have to come in and say, well, I have to take your daughters because she needs a woman. You gonna take what? No, I got this, right? And we tend to say this without understanding the implications of what we say. Think about it this way, biologically. If it is a necessary condition to teach a boy to be a man, that means it's taught and it's not innate. So when you go around and hear people say, you need a man to teach a boy to be a man, well, hold up, dog. She can teach better than you. So the issue now is about the pedagogy of the person versus innate. If I'm innately man, that's going to happen as my walking and my seeing. Those are innate qualities. So I don't need you to teach me to walk. We develop into walking. I don't need you to teach me to see. That's going to happen naturally. All these accoutrements that are socially embedded in me, that can be good and bad, because the very notion of what it means to be a father is going to change as we talk about family. That's going to change around the world, right? So I often tell my students, I'm a male human being such that either I can choose to subscribe to the fundamental concepts of what it means to be a man is different. Because what it means to be a man oftentimes is destructive of what it means to be a human. So the idea here is associating this father notion of being incarcerated and these boys who associate themselves, we have fundamentally inculcated this thinking in them. As we talked yesterday, we beat a kid at home, a kid goes to school, get into a fight, and you say they weren't supposed to do it. Right? Now, Times have changed. Some parents will say, you did exactly what I told you to do, and I'm here to help you out, right? Now, those of you who teach know this experience. This is a weird phenomenon. So the parent comes in as the additional gang member, if you will. So my fundamental issue here is, how do we cultivate a sense of value? And I'm calling this value care, and under this notion of care, love. I'm trying to figure out, when we talk to these gang members, do they have a thoroughgoing, useful, practical, pragmatic sense of love, right? So I'm not telling you don't believe what you believe. I'm asking, is it the most practical to sustain you and others through time, right? Because all gang members eventually have families and children, that they create a notion of what is and what's not permissible. It's interesting moral, right? It's not morally permissible for you to shoot my child, but you can kill me. That's all a part of the game. Weird, right? So what I'm saying is, do you think that's the best concept of love that somehow creates the best social organization, organizing us as a community? And then they'll start in on, well, life has never been kind to me. So we can talk about existential nihilism later. But the point is, I want them to understand love, dude. When you make a decision, ask yourself, am I extending love, which includes dignity and integrity of the other, in such a way that I would ask them to do me the same way? We're clear about violence, right? Do unto me, do unto others. I was beaten, so I'm going to beat. We're clear about that. But there's a tendency we don't say, I was loved. How do I love others? We don't do that, right? And good, as we always, somebody said this yesterday, I think, the good travels at about 10 miles an hour, the bad travels about 1,000 light years a second, right? I mean, and we have to figure out how to do this, because I understand the pain. When you're talking about brothers being in gangs, it's not that their families don't love them either. That's a misnomer. People have a tendency to say they don't have any. Yes, they do have families at home. Remember the notion of Mariology. These various parts create multiple wholes, right? So from internal structures of the family, that's one whole. But that whole participates in a community. That becomes another whole. And so the subgroups of gangs, they represent another facet. We are multifaceted people. I have friends. These friends are called gangster disciples, vice lords, El Rookins. I'm talking about Chicago gangs, right? They go all the way back to the 1950s. And so my point is, I was in Chicago and I'm looking at these guys like, what are you doing? At the end of the day, they're looking for love. Do you appreciate me doing as you said we're supposed to do by definition? And we do it in all of our subgroups, in our fraternities and sororities and our other clubs, even as academics. That's a gang, right? If you don't affiliate with the proper gang, you're condescended to, right? Where did you go? Now I know I'm off the wall. I hate that. Where did you go to school? If what I say is of no value, it's irrespective of where I went to school, right? Right? But my point is, these things are not isolated. Is what I'm trying to show. There's a complex of problems here. Gangs and police, right? We won't talk about this blue shield, right? We in my community call the police a gang, right? Who controls them? And the difficulty for them is that the moral requirements for them are not implied but explicit in their very signature on their contracts, that I will uphold the highest, right? So I don't think there's an easy answer for it, but the short of it is, we're gonna have to act in such a way that our behaviors become mimicked in such a way that love is the act that is mimicked and not the violence that we promulgate against one another. And particularly, last thing about families as well, that internal violence in these families has to be discussed. Remember, I said violence is fundamentally a bioethical issue, right? And the level of violence against family members, against individuals who create different communities like college campuses. So we already have the stats that less than 20% of sisters on college campuses that are sexually assaulted reported, right? That's a health issue, right? Now, how does this, and you psychologists know better than I, and she's talking about the brilliance of this historical memory. What the hell you think is about to happen to this sister in 10 years after that has transpired and she didn't report it, right? And you now have leveled the most traumatic experience, right, and allowed her to live alone without family and without love.
Thank you for such an amazing presentation. You just said that love is an action that is meant. And my question was, do you believe that love is a state of mind or more of an action? Because earlier you said that the U.S. is genetically racist. So that would lead me to think that it's a mindset that we're genetically racist and not an action.
The last part I couldn't hear. You said the mindset?
Yes, so it's the mindset of us being genetically racist and not more so an action.
Oh, well, I was just pushing a metaphor. I mean, there is no genetic makeup of the U.S. I was talking Mariologically again, right? So what I mean by that is I associate racism with institutions and individuals participate in it. Right, so let's take the police, for example. People have a tendency to say, well, it was a black cop that beat those guys up. The black cop is operating under the very concept of racism. The institution of policing has informed them how to undermine my integrity and told them they have the right to do it. So the black cop is merely a pawn. It's being used under the institution that is fundamentally racist. So when I say it's genetic, I'm saying it's built into the very nature of the institution to define the value of the discrete objects that it somehow oversees. You understand? So my point is that if we understand that the institutions were developed, think about it, the United States of America begins, before it's the United States of America, it's a corporation, right? An extension of the British government. Right? And so as they developed banking and other policing, all cultures begin with policing. What do you tell the police? That's a woman. That's a man. That's a certain type of woman. That's a certain type of man. You have the right to do this without recourse to certain levels of punishment. And all I'm saying is that's entrenched. That's fundamentally becomes a part of the institution, and we live under that. For example, women. I try my best to be an advocate for the rights of women and gay, lesbian brothers and sisters, because there's a tendency for us heterosexuals not to understand the struggle, right? Not that I know it, but to even say, again, I love enough to give a damn, that I'm gonna listen, right? So the difficulty there is, like racism, what is my responsibility as a privileged character in this play, right? So my point is, individuals who live under racism, who have certain privileges, white men, right, that have ultimate privilege, what do you do and what do you say to undermine that, what I call that genetic structure there? Are you gonna get in and say, can we, I don't know, refashion, restructure, at least be aware of it? And I'm sorry, the last part of your question.
Do you believe that love is more so an action or a mindset?
And I should even be linguistically even clearer. It's not so much that love is an action as much as the acts that we perform under love, right? Which is different, because if I don't do that, I contradict everything about having a definitive essential definition of love. So I'm not trying to argue that. What I'm saying is when one loves, one behaves. So G.M. Anscombe, philosopher, says the fundamental notion, if I understand that you aspire to do and to be something, there's an attendant behavior associated with it. So if I say I love you, there should be an expectation of acts that fortify your integrity and your dignity, right? So when I'm not doing that, you have every right to say, whoa, what happened to the love? So it's not so much that it is love, it becomes that's my point of the overflow, right? So if I love, like people, I love black people, you don't act like it, right? I love her, you don't act like it. Because we don't want to reduce love to even being articulated. Think about it this way. Philosophically, the problem is this. Once you define a term, if the behaviors associated with that term are not immediately in operation, they don't exist. Right? So some philosophers, if you look at it about now, some philosophers believe that the definition of God, a concept of God, must be that God is eternally the creator. Otherwise, it can't be God. Right? God can't create and stop. Then God is no longer creator. You understand? Love works that way. It has to always be operational. It can never be absent. It always has to be present. So whatever decisions you make, whatever you do, if you claim to be in a position of love, it must always be represented in your behavior. Now, whether or not it's a mindset, that becomes existential, that's personal. I would rather think of it as a virtue ethic that allows for you to engage others, maximizing their integrity and their humanity, right? So this isn't definitive, this is experimental. We're gonna make mistakes. Sometimes I'm gonna assume that I'm representing my love to you, and it might hurt. I have to be willing to say, I'm sorry, let's try something else, right? And people don't do that often, right? I'm sorry, I messed up on that one. Didn't mean to say it, right? Let's try it again, right?
Thank you for this presentation. It's extremely interesting and made me think. I have a question for you and for Dr. Love. My question, it's not a question as much as a comment. This weekend I had the opportunity to meet with a lot of family members, and I was accused constantly by them that I basically am not aggressive enough. I don't stand for what it is I want. And with your presentation, I remember as a child, when I was 4 or 5 years of age, when I learned the concept, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, I embrace. And now I walk with them. And I understood, it was with this, your presentation, it just hit me that I have always treated people as I want them to treat me. But as a result of that, I'm sometimes perceived as being pushed over, not aggressive enough. And I believe that people of color have embraced that. And that's why we find ourselves in a lot of these situations. So I want you to address that, okay? Then I want to turn to you about the historical trauma. We know it, we live it, we now know it's in our DNA. I'm of African descent. I'm not what people would consider part of slavery, but yes, I am, because my ancestors put your ancestors into slavery. So it touches all of us, of people of color, no matter how we may think we escape it. So now for you, the answer is, you know it, you got it. What do we do about that genetic marker that is within us, and it keeps making us live out? That's exactly what our boys do in the street. We keep living it out. How do we change that?
Very quickly, do unto others. As I said, I would rather sort of do the Kant thing than the biblical thing. The idea of universalizability, you universalize your behaviors. You will act in such a way that you would universalize your behavior, right? That means everybody under the similar situation should perform this act this way because you believe it represents moral respect, moral duty to, all right? So my thing is this, you're exemplary of what I often run into, and that is people who are good people are ruined by people like me, for example, right? The idea is this, it's not that you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing, I'm the wrong. I'm the one who's not doing. And people will have a tendency, dating is a big example, right? I no longer date such and such. I don't like these type of, why? Because they hurt me, right? I said the issue isn't your giving and your care. The problem is with the person who didn't understand it was present. The present problem isn't you. They couldn't respond to love, right? So what you need to do is try to figure out how better to choose your range of people, right? Because you're doing exactly what you're supposed to do. And I would hate for you not to do what you're supposed to do because people don't respect people who do what they're supposed to do. I mean, mediocrity abhors excellence, right? So it's always going to have a problem with you. And so they're going to come in and say, oh my God, well, of course you're mediocre. You don't understand this excellence that's going on here. So your response is, well, how do I undermine it? Because misery loves company. That's old, right? So what do? Bring you down. You come with me, right? So the idea of doing unto others, but at the same time, be very careful here. Abuse is always knocking at the door. And again, I go back to sisters. Sisters for years have been abused for trying to love themselves through abuse, right? He needs to go, right? He needs to go. He does. But what has happened? Socially, we've socialized women. You stick in there. I grew up, and I won't mention the particular religious background, but there was a minister who preached when I was probably 10, 11 years old, a woman who was being abused, and he talked about, he gave some anecdote story, and every day he came home, his dinner was cooked, and his shoes were shined. And he did it, and then the next day his shoes, I was like, whoa, 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 stop, whoa. You know how long they've told oppressed people to do that? As much as I love Martin Luther King Jr., that was part of the problem I have in some of his statements about love. He understood the necessity of the oppressed to always demonstrate love. right? That's a problem. Because I can go back to my boy Machiavelli. The issue is not that he's problematic all the way around. His point was, how are you going to be good when they absolutely have decided to be evil? No, they've decided, to the degree to which you've decided to love, they've decided to be evil. What do? You got to cut your losses. I mean, seriously, yeah. If I decide under all circumstances I'm going to abuse you, it has to be some type of self-saving versus self-sacrificing now, right? So my point is, you're doing exactly what I need to be doing. I just need to do more of it. And stop talking to them other people, you know.
Okay, so to the question of, so now we know and what do we do? This is the point that we always like to get to. And I think that the challenge is, how do we generate a new story? Because there has to be a new story in order to interrupt the cycle. So how do we generate a new story? And there are multiple sources that play into the generation of a new story. So I'm just haunted by this student that I passed in the hall the other day. Don't know her name, don't know where to find her, can't go back to her or anything and say, come and let's talk. But part of this interruption of the cycle is in the connection, in the contact, and in the conversation to create the new stories. And new stories come forth from cultural products, from films, and from poetry, and from songs, and from education, and from conferences, and all of this. So I'm thinking about Marian Wright Elderman's work and the Freedom Schools and the effort to interrupt what she calls the cradle to prison pipeline. It starts in infancy. So, you know, this understanding of how the child is being shaped before the child is born and as the child is an infant. The idea that the strongest protective factor that a child can have is nurturing relationships. All around, nurturing relationships in the home, in the extended family, in the community, in the school, everywhere, nurturing relationships. Family reunions, for example. How many people have family reunions? A lot of us have family reunions. What happens at the family reunion? What do you remember about the family reunion? Everybody gets a t-shirt, right? Maybe a bag, maybe a mug, and there might be a church service and a party, a picnic, right? So what if we decided that the family reunion is one of the places where we will begin to tell a new story? What if we decided that all of the children connected with my family, with each of us, if we decided that all of the children connected with our families will understand what historical trauma means and how it carries forward in generations, and would take a vow and make a commitment to change the narrative, to interrupt the cycle? Would it make a difference? I've been working with some people now that are planning the Love Family reunion, and I just moved back to South Carolina, and so I missed a lot of family reunions, and some of them I didn't really pay much attention to them. And at any rate, so now I'm home, and I think I have this ancestral call to fulfill. And that is to use this information and this knowledge and this understanding that I paid and I'm still paying for through student loans to help people, right? To help the family evolve. So I said, why don't we have this time in a space in the reunion where, I mean, at least people can know who we are descendants of. I mean, because people could leave the Love Family Reunion and not know why you came or who John Allen Love was or any of that. So can we have that? And the young people say, oh yeah, let's do that. And so someone organized a workshop and they call it Roots Alive. And so then they said, well, what will we do at the workshop? And I said, well, why don't we try to get everybody to come, all of the generations of people to come. And we have for them some activity sheets. One is a crossword puzzle, and one is a word search, and one is connect the dots. But in order to fulfill the activity, you've got to know about the family. So you've got to go around and talk to everybody, and you've got to ask questions about the family. Now, if this happens, and hopefully this will happen, if this happens, when we leave that gathering, people will leave with not only some new knowledge and some new information, but with some new connectivity, some bonding. And maybe we can move from that to some kind of commitment that if you are a part of this family, these are the things that you value. You value education. You value love. You value entrepreneurship. All these were the things that my grandfather did, and he was a farmer. I mean, he didn't go to college. I mean, he was a farmer, and he knew that in order for him to get ahead, and in order for him to buy land, and in order for him to leave a legacy for his family, there were certain things that he had to do, and those things actually kind of propel the family forward. Now we have some new kinds of challenges, and this is, this is not unique to one family. But I'm saying that we who have this knowledge and who have this awareness and who understand that there's a lot of these social issues, the violence, the imprisonment, all of this is a carry forward. It didn't just now happen, it carries forward. And so if we continue to look for ways for healing strategies that will intercept and intervene and create a new story. I mean, the student said, all I know in the history book is that my people were slaves. Well, what if there's another book? And another book is, this is the new story that we want to live into. So we have to live into a new story. We have to give up the victim story. And to give up the victim story. So when you talk about, because I do oral history, and I do ethnography, and I do family history, and I do personal narrative, and often someone will say, well, there's so much stuff, I can't talk to my family. We have all these secrets. We have all these secrets, and really, all these secrets, that's what we need to talk about. I mean, that's where the healing is needed. Yes. You've got to unmask the pain. We can't just keep covering up the pain and putting on makeup and wearing a mask and heal. Part of the healing is unmasking the pain. And I tell you, there's a group, and actually I think there was some work done here, the Emotional Emancipation Group. And so they came to Howard University and they did a training for us on how to facilitate these emotional emancipation circles. Some of you were part of the group. In the circle, I'll never forget this, the facilitator started off and she said, why do you need emotional emancipation? And so we started around the circle and we just said some really kind of surface, sort of superficial things, and like that, And she stopped and she said, no, wait a minute. You don't hear the question. Why do you today need emotional emancipation? And when she said that, I lost my voice. I mean, I literally lost my voice. The throat chakra closed up. So when they got to me, I said, that's all I could mouth, I can't talk. We went all the way around the circle and came, and then she looked at me and she said, "Are you ready?" I said. So for a good 20 minutes, I could not speak. And I could not speak. And later on, I learned this, somebody told me this, you have frozen tears. You carry a grief that you have not released.
That's right.
Okay. And so my grief was actually, at that moment, it was from personal experience of the loss of my son to suicide. And although I thought I had processed this and I was fine and going on or whatever, but when she really hit the nerve about why you need emotional emancipation, she fingered it and I froze. And afterwards, someone came up to me and she said, you have frozen tears, and when you know you are safe, when you know you have survived, you will be able to release the tears. The tears will flow. When you know that you are survived, you have survived. Because you carry that trauma in your body. You carry the trauma in your body. Well, later on, I'm fine, and I moved to South Carolina, and I went to a massage therapist. And the massage therapist said, why is your body so tight? And so I said, well, I just moved, and I had all this distress and all of this. And she said, well, no, it's more than that, something else going on here. And so she said, what has happened to you? And so then she told her about the loss of my son. And she said, post-traumatic stress settled in your body. And so we are still, now that was just that one thing that happened to me, a couple of years ago, this present time. Now imagine that compounded because of this DNA lineage that we carry. So, we are doing well. If you think about all of that, we are doing well as a people, but we have to do better because we are still not well. We still have all kinds of health issues and emotional issues and psychological issues, learning problems. In working with my students, as students at FAMU, and they did autobiographical writing, and when they shared the stories in class, I said, now I understand why you're not learning. Now I understand, because this is a room full of people that they're operating out of trauma. They have all of this stuff that they're trying to negotiate, and what I'm talking about is way low on the list of priorities. It doesn't measure up in terms of what the psychological and emotional needs are. So now, I've said a lot of things, but going back to your question, I think the solution really is in the creation. First of all, is in being able to talk about those things that we don't want to talk about. My aunts don't want to talk about working on the farm. That was a hard life for them. They don't want to talk about slavery because they associate what their hard life with that historical experience, with the memory of that historical experience, a socially constructed memory that they have no autobiographical memory of. But the healing comes from all of these things. It comes from the emotional emancipation circle. It comes from the healing network and participating in the days of healing and going back to the family histories and using those opportunities that we have in our family reunions and in our churches and in our social organizations, using all of the resources that we have to make a commitment to changing the narrative, and then producing stories, producing books, producing textbooks, producing children's activities and games, et cetera, et cetera. So a massive cultural commitment of products and strategies that will infuse the minds and consciousness of people to the power of living into a new future, a new story.
Thank you all for sharing it. Dr. Davis, I kind of believe that men are on the evolutionary road towards displaying love. For instance, when a man says to another man, I respect you, I think that's code for I love you. Men used to extend hands and shake. There was a pop finger shake or a shoulder shake. Now some are embracing when they meet. Men in Baltimore, where I am, many of us are beginning to talk about coming together to talk about, share our journeys along the way for healing and for moving forward. Where do you see men in our evolving towards display of love that will not only impact how we embrace each other as men, kiss my sons all the time, tell them I love them all the time, the other men do the same thing too, doesn't feel strange, actually feels great. But where do you see men in that evolution, and what are some practices that might be employed to help in the process?
Thank you, thank you. And I commend you for taking steps that a generation before you, didn't do that, right? There's some mitigating behaviors that still bother me, and I'll start there. I see students at school, and I tell them all the time, perfect example, come here, sir. I tell my students all the time, when you're talking to a guy, right, the issue is he feels extremely uncomfortable right now. Do you understand this? That's a problem, right? And he would feel even more uncomfortable if I talked like this. Now, you can go ahead, it's all right. It seems superficial, but what I'm saying is the first thing we need to do is get in touch with our humanity, right? As I said before, our genetic biological predispositions to be a male human and a female human are going to come forth irrespective of my desire. So whatever my testosterone is going to do is going to do it, right? But what's going to distinguish me from other animals is my ability to undermine the destructive aspects, right? So if I wish to engage in physical fisticuffs with someone because of my testosterone levels, this is the way it's taught, right? I can choose not to. So my issue oftentimes is focused on what is it to me, what does it mean to be a human being? How do we cultivate this? And there are certain concepts, again, how do I love, how do I express dignity and integrity to others such that when I do this, I am being human and cultivating my own humanity at the same time. To be human is not merely to exist. You gotta live. And so what I'm trying to force is this way of living, cultivating. So I try to do work. Michel Foucault has several essays, one of the beautiful lectures, The Care of the Self. And he does an analysis of what is this self that you need to be in care of. And there's a difference between caring for the thing and caring for the uses of the thing. And what he shows is our bodies become tools. So there must be something else you're supposed to be caring for, and then you come out with something like a soul, right? That's the thing that has to be cultivated and refined. So the difficulty is you have on one side certain social forms, social determinisms. We have become men based on our social locations, right? I walk a certain way, I wear certain things, I do and say particular behavior. There are these behaviors that indicate, well, he's masculine, right? But then what we don't do is tell boys particularly, and oftentimes it's gonna get the girls maybe more profound, is that you don't have to do this. That's the danger, and a lot of parents get it. You don't have to do that. So when I see my students on campus and I give them a pound, it's never affectionate, it's always ended by hitting me on the back, like this. What is that about? What's the added? Because of we're anti-homosexual, and I don't say homo, it's not about a fear, it's you absolutely hate gay people. And I think we need to be honest about that. We hate them. It's not about, I'm not afraid. No, you're not afraid, you hate them. Look at what you do. You undermine their integrity. And that's what's feeding our warped sense of what it means to be male humans, right? If I say I love him, what are they going to say about me, right? If I hope, people love to say, well, in Africa, well, hold up. Whatever that is, right? Go to Kenya. Why do the men hold hands? The USSR, after they perform their gymnastics, why do they kiss each other in the mouth? We have sexualized everything where we can't be human. I can't hold you, I can't hug you. If you cry, there's a certain way I got to respond. You be all right, dog. You be all right. You cool. You know what I'm saying? I'm here for you, dog. What is this? And so you all are doing a wonderful thing by at least initiating, saying, look, what do you feel? Right? And I don't mean to be an armchair psychologist, you know. How do you feel? Right? But what I'm trying to get to is, what is your initial response? Not that you need to perform it, but you got to articulate it. So if you feel like crying, cry. And no one in the room is going to treat you like a man. We're going to treat you like a human being. Right? I don't think there's one answer. I think you all are doing a wonderful job. My difficulty is because I have college-age men, is to getting them to go back, retract, and recalibrate. So they go back. I do not listen. I said this again last. I don't listen to guys who come to me and say, well, my daddy wasn't home. So everybody who's there for you gets no point. They get nothing, right? All those people who supported and advocated and strengthened you and made you the person you are today, they're excluded because someone told you the proper genitalia wasn't available. No, I don't take that. So when they come in with Professor Davis, you know, I didn't have this and I lived it. Dude, been there. Everyone has a story. Let your story come forth, but don't let it undermine your ability to say you're free and you can make a decision not to allow that to undermine your integrity. I mean, what is the first road? The road to recovery is what? Admission. So you just told me these were your problems and you want me to excuse you from behaving a certain way because they're your problems. And that's a certain masculine notion that we allow because, like I said, on the other side, when you talk about black women, I was reared by black women. They did an excellent job. Not so much with me because they taught me better than I am, right? And I understand that. But they did a wonderful job of trying, right? They really, really, really tried. And I appreciate that. What I would, my humble suggestion is keep doing it, but push this idea of what is it about who you believe you are that's undermined by these social factors, right? Do you have to play sport? I got all my friends with sons. Oh my God. Oh my God. Let's do such and such Saturday. No, man, I gotta take my son to the football. All of these guys really think their kids are going to the NFL and NBA. Don't let them lie to you. They do. They really, really, really do. Right? And so my issue, they think that's superficial. I'm saying that's profound because not only are you living vicariously through your child, there's still this thoroughgoing, destructive, masculine thing working on here, man. Because I even have a dear friend of mine over 30 years. I remember he said, I want to have a son. He had a daughter. I want to have a son. I said, why? And then I knew I was going to get him upset. I said, what if your son's gay? Stop! Stop! Do you understand that? I said, what if your son's gay? I said, that's not a criticism, first of all. You're stupid enough to think it is. But my issue has more to do with, don't try to make a man. That's what you think you're about to do. He's going to be born. You're going to give him a ball. You're going to tussle and wrestle. I have 2 daughters. Why, after bringing them in public when they're 3 months, is it a boy or a girl? Why do you want to know? It's a baby. You know what they want to do? Hey, little fella. Yeah. A little girl. Oh, she's so. It begins. And now look at all of us. I wear and act the way I do because, hey, little fella, I'm the youngest of 6. My 3 adopted brothers, they used to beat me up, right? My sisters, they were refined, cultivated, even though they're still rough around the edges, my point is, we do this at such an early stage that you are breaking that. You got to get in and be emotional, show love, express, right? To let them know, dude, you don't have to be that type of being. You can create. This is the value of existentialism. Create yourself. Self-creating is wonderful. Pull back. Sometimes we know when social influences have impinged upon our ability to make decisions. Sometimes we don't. But that's the psychological beauty of it all, right? If I know I am violent because it's acceptable as a man to be violent? Right? And the last story, I'll tell you anecdotally, I was in school with a brother at Morehouse, and his young lady was at Spelman. She was a multi-degree black belt. We used to tell them, how does it feel knowing she will beat your butt? No, she was, no, seriously, man. She will do you. Now, why do we do this? Because we understood, by definition, men are protectors. We don't hunt food anymore. We don't need that qualification. You understand how problematic, I mean, with all of these social issues, we don't hunt food. So whatever biology and genetic gave us, that's useless now. I mean, me having bigger muscles doesn't stop a hollow point 45. She's carrying one. You understand what I'm saying? So dude, pull back. I would love for people to embrace the possibility of rebuffing these social categories, because if we are genetically predisposed to be who we are, that ain't a choice, right? So if your son is gonna grow up to be, they're gonna grow up to be, what they're gonna learn from you is how to be publicly human, humane, integrity, dignity, and love before it's too late, right?
Any more questions? There's one to ask right now. No, there's many anymore. Well, there's nine. There it is.
What are your thoughts about the way society is changing the role in terms of who works and who doesn't work, who stays at home, and the perception of, for instance, I'm a physician and my husband is retired and he stays home and he handles the house. The comments that we get from that about the men, the body,
you're not supposed to be up.
But the thing about it works. Our family runs very, very well because it works for us. But the scrutiny and the baggage and misconception that goes along with that is sometimes very hard to take.
No, I mean, you've said it. I mean, when I was married, my first daughter, I stayed at home with her the first 3 years of her life. I mean, there are some valuable, I know people say Eurocentric, but there's some valuable critiques of Marx about the family being oppressive, right? The very structure, right? When you have these asymmetrical power dynamics, it's him, her, and kids. No. Antiquated, if not ever needed. And so I think the appropriate thing is you allow the particular talents to come through. If I were married to you, I'd stay home. I always tell people, I tell my students all the time, I say, dude, you bring, all right, and it's not a bad thing, but if you go to school and the job that corresponds with that, you yield 35, 40. She's a neuroscientist, she's making 700,000. Really? Are you really about to fight over this? I'm saying, when you have, my point is, if someone has to stay home, seems like the decision's been made, right? Are you really about to tell her this? Are you stupid? And stupid does have a value. That's when people know better and they don't do it, right? So my issue has more to do with allowing the particular talents to be represented. If I'm married to an accountant, but I want to run the books, what are you doing? And I got some friends, even though he makes a little less than her, he still controls the money. That's oppression. That's violence, right? Well, she can do what she want with her money, but she makes twice what you do. Now, the difficulty is trying to break the chains and images of psychological slavery, brother, right? Because we do have women who have embodied, like black people have embodied racist ideologies. Women have embraced sexism too. So I can meet a sister, she'd be like, oh no, he will. And it's like, well, what if it's more practical for you? No, my money's for me, he's gonna pay the bills with his. You make $300,000, he makes 70. Who pays the mortgage? He does. Do you understand that? Why? And then some of my male friends, I asked the students the other day, I said, why wouldn't you invite Why wouldn't you invite a gentleman to marry you? And a guy jumped in, I wouldn't marry her under any circumstances. Really? You want to be married, but you won't ask? That's not how it's done. Well, in philosophy, that's a fallacy of tradition. The mere reflection on past events does not give you the proper right to infer future behaviors, right? And you cannot ground your beliefs merely in the fact that something used to happen. Whatever used to happen must be of value in order for you to continue to do it. It's not by virtue of it being past, right? So just because we used to do something doesn't mean it needs to be done. You're doing exactly what needs to be done, right? And the issue is you recalibrate and evaluate over time and ask us, is it the best practical solution for our particular situation? I stayed home with my daughter for 3 years. It was needed. I was in graduate school. She was a school teacher. Money, no money, right? It made sense. I mean, it was just, and an interesting thing, those of you who went to graduate school, that's one beautiful thing about the college intellectual university life. You get more diversity. There are more people who are like, yeah, receptive. There were a lot of guys, we were at home, right? Because we were in graduate school, and when we had children, it was more practical for us to be there. But we got a serious problem about the profundity of sexism that impinges on women directly, because guys will celebrate his ability to control someone. When a guy can't control you physically, he'll do it monetarily, right? And I don't care how much money you got. How much did you, what did you do? He's controlling your money. The fundamental reason for divorce is what? Money is at the top of the list. Not staying home, money. Because like I said, I will stay home for you, that ain't no problem, right? But we have to figure out how do we redress the profundity of sexism that forces us not to embrace a humble position, right? If you're good at that, you do it. If I'm not, I don't do it. If you can do it. All y'all got kids, right? How many times have you seen your child walk past some paper and their response is, I didn't drop it? This is a beautiful metaphor. If it needs to be done, do it. The laundry ain't hers. The grass ain't mine. If it needs to be done, all things considered, you physically are capable, pick it up, move it. You don't understand how much this creates problems for families? Well, I'm not doing it until my husband comes home. Wow, you're gonna sit here and wait for him. And the contrary, right? I'm not gonna do this because my wife will prepare. That's a problem. I don't know how to get, this is how many years, I don't know, 10,000? At least, this ain't something we're gonna be able to solve.
We'll have one more before we have our brunch.
Panel so very much. My brother, Dr. Davis, comment kind of, and then question for Dr. Love. Thank you so much, because Harriet Tubman was often posed the question about how do you do those manly things, walking through the woods at night, carrying a gun, and threatening to shoot people? Wasn't that, kind of manly thing? She said, no, it wasn't. It wasn't a man's job. It was a job that had to be done. That's right. So, Dr. Love, kind of on that part, I really appreciate the intergenerational healing. In terms of, you mentioned the diviner, where have you seen women, research women, or even in the story that you gave, the case that you gave, can you say some more about women participation in divination and or in that ancestral healing?
Thank you. In my research, I have actually come across more male diviners than I have female diviners, but I have interviewed several female diviners, and one in particular I recall at Oyotunji Village in South Carolina. And this woman actually told a healing story, and this was many years ago when she first, early on, I think the village was established in 1970. So she had been newly initiated and was still learning the practice. And the people in the community were a little bit leery of these folk, of course, who had moved in, but then they heard that there was some healing going on, just some medical or I guess kind of folk medicine, traditional healing practices, and someone came to her with a daughter who was ill, very ill physically, or we don't know, I mean the symptoms were physical. She said that when they came in, the young woman was actually leaning on someone, and she had her sitting in the chair, and she began to do some of the ritual work that she had been trained to do, found out about her medical history and what was going on with her, began her chants, which were part of the ritual, and she saw a physical change right before her eyes. So she told me that was one of the stories that was shared with me about how this young woman actually responded, and she said, and when this happened, I knew then that I was in my right work. So yes, in terms of the diviners, there are women. There are some schools of thought that women should not be diviners, and in some of the practicing groups, they don't initiate women, but in many of the ones, the lead diviners that I have come across, they're females.
I think I'm going to be the last question. Oh, okay. All right, good. Dr. Jackson, for question. These traditional definitions of families, do you believe that they have been a hindrance or a detriment to us? And specifically us as people of color. And I say that kind of with tongue-in-cheek because I kind of know the answer. And if so, why?
I think that family in the African American community is not just nuclear. The family has always been extended. And again, I go back to Dr. Warren's comment. She's my auntie because you told me she was my auntie. And it has been that extended family, the ability to build into a system of extension that has provided the support and the survival. I mean, what happened in enslavement when your mom and dad were sold? You had to have someone to go to, and that's where family comes in, whether it's biological or whether it's social. And family is socially constructed and culturally constructed. As I just said, what is family here is not family somewhere else. And the only thing that makes family destructive is when we turn on each other. If we can't support each other, if we're not there for each other, if we don't advocate for each other, then family can become oppressive. But when we unite at whatever level, whether it's in the home or in the community or in the nation, that's when we can have success. Does that answer your question?
Dr. Jackson, this is directed at you, and I think you brought it home to me because I love that passage in the Bible in 1 Corinthians about love. And you mentioned what is a family. Well, we have a lot of people here that are descendants of men that was in the simplest way. And we're trying to find that healing, that love, that we can forget what happened, and you brought in historical trauma. Well, this was historical trauma.
Oh, yeah.
Because we didn't know how to accept. Our parents didn't tell us anything about it. And, you know, that's why we're here. And that's why we have a foundation, Voices for our fathers. Because we want to get that historical trauma healed in us. And not only that, there are layers of family. Like we have become a family. The descendants have become a family. Looking to each other for support, looking for each other for love. And the best example of love that I can give you, no one mentioned this in this agape love is the unconditional love that Jesus Christ died for us to give us eternal life. We have all kinds of love. Dr. Davis referred to it, sexual love, fantasy love. I mean, there's all kinds of love out there. But the epitome of love is agape love. And, we all try to attain that love because that is what we're put down here to do. Okay, now, the love rejoices in the truth. So the love rejoices in the truth. So he said, the love rejoices in the truth. And that's what we are seeking is truth. And trying to put it all together. And I thank you for bringing that about the family because it's not just our microcosm of is an extension here, is an extension in the school, is an extension in the community, is an extension in the county, the nation, and the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. We have a continental quasi brunch for you. Get it and bring it in as we prepare for our next session.